evening, everybody. Welcome to week 6 of the weekly readings. Now, this is one of those readings that just kind of stays with me. And to be honest, it's not a long reading, and actually it's not one I need to say too much about. But it's just ever since I read it back in 2010, so on my masters, it just has kind of made me laugh so much because it's not just a test of how accurate is a television show. It's actually a test of what actually happens when you watch the television show. And then in this case specifically, it's a broader and more interesting test around this concept of kind of what happens when you believe the secret source. And I just think that's a fascinating kind of question here. You know, it doesn't set out to do this, but it's almost kind of testing that Colin Stagg idea of what happens when you believe the hype and what does that actually do to your accuracy. So for those of you who don't know, there'll be a small clip of this show inserted into the weekly lecture, but basically Lie to Me was this. It didn't run long, 3-season TV show that was broadly based on the life of a guy called Paul Ekman. Paul Ekman is a phenomenal psychologist. The original story of him is that he basically just went and lived in all these different rural tribes and indigenous areas and studied basically these universal human facial expressions, right? And if you've ever watched Lie to Me, I mean, it's built into the lore of the program. But one of the things that he basically studies or focuses on so deeply is this idea that the human mind can't inhibit the impulse to react fast enough. And that's where this idea of the micro expression comes from, is it's this moment in time where you see the truth before the brain catches up quick enough in order to stop it. Now, if you ever watch the TV show, Tim Roth does a phenomenal job of playing a twisted and scorned psychologist with a dark history. Who's phenomenal, runs a company called the Lightman Group. And basically he consults on all of these cases, and his job is very much the classic TV psychologist job of kind of, you know, coming in and talking to people, and he can instantly tell if they're lying because he's this micro expression detection expert. Now, I cannot emphasize enough just how many people have bought the micro expression source. I mean, it's actually ridiculous to think about how many people have been. I mean, like if you go on there's a clip again in the class of me doing the micro expression training, not very effectively, and it's like $229 per person. Like, but if you look at how many corporations and companies have bought into it, and it's because it leans into this idea that deception detection can be done, it's a skill, it's trainable, there are experts in deception detection, and if we just all, you know, learnt to look at a few micro expressions every now and then, we would actually be able to see that. So what Tim Levine here does in this paper, and if I ever meet him, I'm going to sit him down and talk to him about this, and he'll probably be like, I've done so many more impressive papers than this one, and I'm like, I don't care, this is the paper for me. He basically says, like, well, what happens if you show Lie to Me to people and then you ask them to do it? Like, in theory, you could hypothesize that they become better because, you know, they pick up tips and tricks off, you know, Cal Lightman, and they become better at detecting deception. You know, maybe they try harder, whatever it is. Or it could be that they get much worse, and we can talk about why that might be. So we'll just start with the sales pitch, of Lie to Me, from writer Samuel Baum and the executive producers of 24. So you know it's going to be good. And Arrested Development comes Lie to Me, a compelling new drama series inspired by the scientific discoveries of Paul Ekman, a real-life specialist who can read cues embedded in the human face, body, and voice to expose both truth and lies in criminal investigations. If anyone ever describes my career as good as that, I'll retire tomorrow. Side note about Paul Ekman. He's also the psychological consultant on a bunch of Pixar and DreamWorks movies, Inside Out. So he's phenomenally good, don't get me wrong. I'm not entirely sure he can read cues embedded in my face, but there we go. Anyway, so what this basically paper sets out to do is it kind of basically says that, right, the findings on whether people are good or not at detecting deception is relatively mixed. So let's have a look at what would happen if people view Lie to Me and basically believe that identifying lies is something that can be done. And so it's really interesting. It's not so much that they're teaching them the specific things that are in Lie to Me. It's not like they've said in Lie to Me they list 20 different ways, right? Verbal and non-verbal, that you can spot deception, and then you go and use those. It's more the belief and almost creating the effort. And I'm sure there are some tips in the scenes there that kind of they're testing here. So they set up, I mean, it's not particularly complicated. They set up basically a classic kind of between subjects experiment where they have a kind of so they have three different groups. So one group watches Lie to Me, one group watches Numbers, and one group watches a no television drama control. Now this is actually a really interesting methodological concept, because had they just shown them Lie to Me and then just shown them a control group, you technically could have argued that it might not have been Lie to Me per se. It could have just been the effect of watching a police show or a police drama, or being in almost like a priming a kind of the idea of being an investigator, rather than specifically the idea that it is just the lie to me aspect. So the design on it's a really good little move they've pulled there, and I'm a really, really big fan of it. So I just want to see if they have if it tells you the actual scene. Let's see if we can get to that. I don't think it does say precisely what scene they do. So anyway, so they watch these scenes. So Lie to Me, Numbers. I've never watched Numbers. Crimes were solved by a genius math professor. I mean, obviously, of course they were. And no television drama group at all. So they probably watched some kind of... They might have watched nothing, or they might have just watched something completely unrelated, like a cooking show. So then they used... Levine owns basically a database of... 100 videotapes of lies or truths created by undergraduate students. So he can give them to them. And again, if you've watched this week's lecture, mine is a poor man's version of it, but you'll see the exact same kind of thing. You watch them tell a benign story, and you assess how accurate, you assess whether they're telling the truth, honesty, all this kind of stuff, right? So they watch the clip, Lie to Me, Numbers, or something else, and then they basically watch a series of these videotaped speeches by these students, and they have to say to themselves, or they have to assess, right, were they lying or not? Okay. So there was 12 videos each, it says. So then I'm not going to go through the numbers over here on this page, but I'm just going to go straight to table 1, because table 1 is fascinating. So let's have a look at the accuracy and the truth bias for Lie to Me, Numbers, and Control. So truth bias. So the truth bias, as I mentioned in class, is the idea that we are on average more likely to assume that somebody is lying. Okay. Now, as you can see in the control group is basically your bog standard, like what would the everyday person do just if they were guessing lies or not with no intervention. So 60% truth bias and 65% total accuracy. So that's actually pretty good. That's actually quite high. So 65% of the time they were right, and 60% of the time they just guessed truth anyway. And so if you look then at basically how many times they predicted that someone was telling the truth correctly, 75%. So pretty good at telling people are telling the truth. And how often did they think people were lying? Just a 56%. So a bit less accurate there at basically predicting when, or spotting, if you will, when somebody was lying. Now, let's look at the Lie to Me group, because this is a really interesting thing. So total accuracy, 59%. So that is 5% lower than the control. So they're 5% worse overall at knowing if someone is telling the truth or a lie after watching Lie to Me. Truth bias, 50%. 10% less likely to say that somebody is that somebody is telling the truth when they are. But basically, the base assumption that people are telling the truth. So 10%. And if you look at the numbers case, the numbers is slightly down on the control, but it's still way up from the lie to me group. So 8% lower than the lie to me group is 8% lower than the numbers group, right? In terms of total accuracy, 2% lower than the numbers group. In terms of truth accuracy, 10% lower than the numbers group, and 75% lower than the control group. I mean, those are ridiculously low numbers. And then in their overall lie accuracy, they're only slightly better than the control anyway, but they're a bit higher than the numbers group. So what does that tell you that's gone on here? Right, what's really interesting here is it basically tells you that they've watched a TV show about detecting deception, and they have got quantifiably worse at detecting deception. And the main reason that I love this study, and I actually think the biggest take-home point from this study, it's a very short study, so I don't get into all of it, but the biggest take-home point from this study is not so much that a TV show doesn't teach you how to spot lies. That's not really that surprising. The really interesting thing about this study is the idea that when you try to do something, you become worse at it than people who just kind of are doing it naturally. And this, I think, comes down to the idea of when you try and detect if someone is lying or not, you're constantly looking for evidence to confirm your assumption that they are lying. And that evidence can come in many different ways. But you over-attend and hyper-focus on potential cues to dishonesty at the cost of a more objective, holistic perception of the scene. And so from a psychological standpoint, this is something that we would kind of call almost the motivational overriding effect, which is the idea that the motivation to achieve something makes you much worse at it. It's a very, very human thing, right? I mean, so I play a lot of golf. As a golfer, the attempt to swing fast usually makes you swing slower. It's almost Alan Watts, the philosopher, calls it a reverse paradox, right? The attempt to spot a lie actually makes you worse at it. And I think it's such an interesting thing because so much of the output of this bit of psychology is teaching people to spot liars, teaching people techniques, teaching people cues and indicators. Yet this study shows you that teaching people cues and indicators realistically might actually make them worse at what they were doing before, because now you're artificially making them process the situation in a way that they naturally wouldn't, and you're lowering their base belief in truth. Now, it might be different if you're dealing with a criminal population who we could assume potentially are lying a lot more often, but overall, this study shows that trying to teach people to be lie detectors is the worst thing you can do for them. And I just think that's a fascinating kind of conclusion and output of this study. So look, it's a really short reading, but I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you just take home that kind of counterintuitive message of trying to teach people to be lie detectors actually made them worse, like the worst of anything you could do. And it's not because they got better at detecting lies, they kind of hovered there, but they just got worse at detecting the truth because they were trying so hard to spot the lie. So I really hope you enjoyed it. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you in the lecture on Thursday.